In the southern hemisphere, to the southeast of Australia, New Zealand is made up of two main islands, the North Island and the South Island. Wellington is the capital, Auckland is the largest city. New Zealand has very contrasting landscapes. The welcoming lands and verdant plains can suddenly give way to turbulent coastlines. The coast stretches for over 15,000 kilometres. Between the volcanic sand beaches and the country's highest peaks, the lush forest gives way to dramatic mountains. On the South Island, the mountains reach impressive heights. In the Southern Alps, the highest peak is over 3,700 metres. Less mountainous than its neighbour, the North Island has a strong geothermal presence. The vegetation has been largely untouched for thousands of years, and some species are living fossils. The wild forest, which covered most of the territory long ago, thrives in the extremely humid climate. Vegetation is not only abundant, it's also unique. In fact, 80% of the species are endemic. New Zealand has been isolated for a long time, but the wind has allowed lighter seeds to blow onto the islands. Insects and birds have also played a crucial role in the biodiversity of the country. In an environment totally devoid of predators, some birds have lost their ability to fly. One of these birds has become a true national emblem. The kiwi, a bird which cannot fly. In the Middle Ages, the first people to come to the islands were Polynesian. It was here that they founded the Maori culture and took possession of the territory in several successive waves. It wasn't until the 17th century that the European colonists arrived. The English officially proclaimed their sovereignty in 1840. They signed a treaty negotiated with the Maori people. The treaty, which is still controversial, is seen as the founding document of New Zealand. The country distanced itself from England by gaining independence in 1947. The Maori people were a warrior force to be reckoned with. Their stance and face-pulling aimed to scare the enemy. In different ways, Maori customs and culture spread over the centuries. Its war dances and chants are still practiced today and can be seen in the rugby player's famous haka. New Zealand's population is a reflection of the country's openness to the outside world via the Indian and Pacific Oceans. But the descendants of European settlers make up the ethnic majority. The abundance of water and boundless nature encourages outdoor activities. It's also good for outdoor sports, and notably water sports, which Kiwis excel at. Using a unique country as its base, sport found a brilliant playing field. Among all the activities which are practiced in harmony with nature, the English heritage is ever present. In certain sports, New Zealand has reached a level of excellence. For example, rugby. New Zealand has fewer than 4.5 million inhabitants. It's a very urban population, with 86% of New Zealanders living in cities. Its housing reveals several influences from Western culture, but the country also knows how to adapt to a very particular environment. And when buildings are destroyed by an earthquake, they are temporarily replaced with containers. Western tradition has also filtered into religion. 50% of New Zealanders are Christian. Deforestation made room for agriculture, which makes up over 40% of the country's surface area. Thanks to soil improvement, agricultural production is the main source of export revenue in New Zealand. Certain specialities contribute to the reputation of the country overseas. For example, vineyards, where acreage has tripled over the last 15 years. The temperate climate is great for poultry production and particularly for sheep. New Zealand is one of the largest producers of wool in the world. At least once a year, the sheep must be sheared. It's a vital operation. Thanks to the shearer's skill, it only takes a few minutes to do on a compliant sheep. Also appreciated for their wool, alpacas were brought in to increase New Zealand's livestock. Diversification gives the country's breeders new opportunities. Several species have been adapted to meet the needs of the meat and leather industry. Some of them have to live on large plains. The deer appreciate the space they have for the entire herd. New Zealand controls the 4th largest fishing area in the world, a very dynamic sector for export. The country benefits from a multitude of natural resources, starting with the ocean. The Pacific allows for raw materials to be transported, such as gas, oil and coal. This industry alone supplies a quarter of its gross domestic product. A good chunk of economic activity relies on energy production. New Zealand plans to produce 90% green energy in the near future. The country serves as a benchmark for renewable energy. Communication is vital in a country where only the coastlines are densely populated. To avoid traffic jams or long inland detours, the solution can be found via the sea. The use of boats and ferries has become a daily necessity for many New Zealanders. Air links are important to break up the country's isolation and to cross the 1,600 kilometres that separate the northern and southern part of the territory. It's essential to have high-quality communication between the Antipodes and Europe. Whether on land or water, nature here is accessible and you can get right up close to it. This is great for tourism, which is constantly developing and has become one of the main economic sectors. The countless sports at hand make the most of these spectacular surroundings, leaving thrill seekers fulfilled. Just like group activities, the most original specialised sports are evolving. Here all sports can take on new challenges. Today, bungee jumping has become one of those classic sports. On the other side of the world, New Zealand has close ties with nature. The North Island is smaller than its southern neighbour. Nevertheless, it has more inhabitants, since it makes up 3/4 of the country's population. It's here that the most populated city sprawls out, Auckland. Auckland is one of the most stretched out cities in the world, and the water going right into the heart of the city opens up the landscape. The country's population is very small. That said, 1/3 of New Zealanders live in Auckland. The country has experienced phenomenal growth. In the 19th century, the population multiplied almost tenfold. Auckland is the economic capital of the country. It has a very broad influence and considerable appeal. It's estimated that the city will soon reach 2 million inhabitants, mainly due to immigration. Auckland has maintained multiple traces of its recent colonial past. The old buildings allude to a small provincial town. The city fares well in the list of nicest cities to live in. Auckland's success is showcased by its modern architecture. The Sky Tower reflects that loud and clear. The tower is the symbol of an isolated country keeping track with modernity. At the top, a walkway allows daredevils to both admire the landscape and to test out the laws of balance. Do a few stretches, stay calm, and your memories will be spectacular. The bravest choose to jump.
No, not really. Nothing crazy like this. This is pretty crazy. I am in New Zealand, so why not try this?
Yes, in New Zealand, they like adrenaline-fueled experiences.
The sky jump here is 192 metres high, so it's the biggest jump in New Zealand. We're pretty persuasive. There are a couple of people that will back out, but only maybe about 1 or 2%. We can usually help people get off the edge.
The fall is controlled by a wire cable. It's easy, you just have to jump.
3, 2, 1, go!
The hardest thing is smiling for the camera. A few seconds later, it becomes an unforgettable experience.
Beautiful view. I didn't rush on the way down and I got no words for it.
There are some more low-key ways to appreciate Auckland, but while savouring its tranquility, you should bear in mind that the city actually rests on top of a volcanic plate. A survey of 50 dormant volcanoes, some of which are well preserved, shows that there is not too much to worry about. The last eruption happened 600 years ago. Auckland has a very mild climate, owing to its proximity to the ocean. The town is ideally located between two natural ports which open out onto the Pacific, the east and the west. It's an exceptional situation which makes sailors happy, and there are quite a few of them. Auckland is often called the City of Sails. Boats are counted in their tens of thousands. In fact, this city has the most boats per capita of anywhere in the world. That meant solutions had to be found to stow the boats away. Fishing is a very promising economic activity in New Zealand. The Auckland fish market demonstrates the country's wealth of marine biodiversity. With 150 fish species, seafood products boost both exports and employment. Right in the city centre, there's a ferry terminal. It's ideally situated because it allows for quick, frequent trips to the archipelago islands. The way the city opens out onto the water eases communication and controls pollution. A half-hour ferry ride will get you to the island of Waiheke, which is 20 kilometres long. It is centrally located in the Gulf of Hauraki, to the east of Auckland. The gentle ocean, long sunny days and quality of the soil are all good for farming, particularly for vineyards. All the major grape varieties, red, white and even the most difficult ones are grown here. It provides the very best conditions for Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay or Syrah. This vineyard was planted at the turn of the 19th century. New Zealand still only represents 1% of the worldwide wine-growing regions, but its wine has an excellent reputation. Patrick Newton manages the vineyard.
Over the past 30 years, the level or the quality level of the wines has increased dramatically, and that's for a variety of reasons. Many of those come from the actual training of the young viticulturalists and winemakers, and also these young people are going overseas and gaining international experience in the likes of France, the United States and Australia.
On the island of Waiheke, the climate is also good for olive trees. Vegetation grows in the direction of the sun by growing over the foliage. You have to go over it to reach the top. And surprise! This is where you can learn to safely pass over nature and better admire it. We're now leaving Auckland, heading to the north of the North Island. After about 50 kilometres, the landscape opens up even more. It's dominated by farming activities, but the hills hold some surprises in store. A major collector has built up some outstanding artwork. The huge Muriwai beach is surrounded by rocks. Northern gannets take to the air in a majestic flight. The large seabirds form very dense colonies. With northern gannets, there's no difference between the male and female. The birds recognize their partner from the territory it occupies. But that doesn't stop them from tearing each other's hair out. In the Waipua forest, vegetation reaches abnormal dimensions. The ancient forest is intriguing and fascinating. It commands respect from all who go near it. The Maori chant grew from a prayer addressed to deities in the forest. The warm, humid climate here has produced giant species which the Maori people cherish. Bill Matthews pays homage to them. A giant tree, a 50-metre-high kauri, is the Maori's god of the forest. Its name? Tani Mahuta. In the original forest, the Maori people used certain vegetation in a very practical way.
When they go into the forest, they take the fronds of the silver fern and they place it on the ground, facing the opposite direction. When they go into the forest, they drop it along the way.
A subtropical climate reigns over the northernmost parts of the country. The plant species have various profiles and adapt to the environment. In Paihia, the coast is fringed with a mangrove which thrives in slightly salty water. The mangrove trees form a very dense tangle. Without a guide, getting your bearings and going through it is impossible. The mangrove is an endless reservoir of wildlife, aquatic life and land life. Birds such as the Australian pied cormorant have chosen it as their home. Martin Vreed is an expert on their habits.
What they'll do is they'll colonate one particular tree until that tree dies, and then they'll move to the next tree. So for some reason they like to stick together.
Further up north, the Bay of Islands opens out onto an immense expanse of water. The ferry allows for quick access to several villages which are scattered around the bay. It also stops off at some of the islands. The region was the first in New Zealand to be colonised by the Europeans. And in the village of Waitangi, the famous treaty was signed with the English. The first arrivals were intimidated by the natives' war chants, and we can understand why. Maoris were actually cannibals. They'd stick their tongue out to let the enemy know they were going to get eaten. It was a very effective deterrent. Seaward, Russell was the first seaport in New Zealand founded by the Europeans. Many plant species were imported onto the islands by sailors from Europe. Some species had less of a journey. Originating from an island in the north of the country, the Norfolk Island pine is recognisable from its silhouette. Thousands of kilometres away from the European continent, the Bay of Islands coastline was not as peaceful as it seemed. The big colonial powers engaged in fierce competition. Their struggle for power stretched to all aspects of daily life. The local architecture still bears the mark of the colonists. Their memory also lives on thanks to these monumental trees. A giant fig tree was planted at the end of the 19th century. This strong colonial rivalry was also expressed through religion. As a way of fighting against the spread of the Anglican Church, the French created a mission at Russell. It's the oldest building in the country built by Catholics. The Bay of Islands owes its name to the 144 islands scattered around there. Along the 800-kilometre shoreline, the bay is blessed by nature. You have to get up at the crack of dawn to observe the marine wildlife. With a little patience, the silhouettes of dolphins soon start to appear. The common bottlenose dolphin is the most well-known species. It can be found in all the world's seas. When it hits the water's surface, the dolphin is expressing itself. But it's still unclear whether it's trying to be intimidating or show that it's satisfied. The black rocks appear on the surface of the Bay of Islands. The compact boulders are made up of basalt, a volcanic rock. These rocks came out of the water during an eruption over 1 million years ago. The 9-pin rock is a focal point in the ocean. The Bay of Islands was left untouched by man. The beaches, the islands, the sea inlets, nature there has remained intact. It's said that after Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, the Bay of Islands has the bluest sky in the world. We can understand why seafarers over several centuries have chosen to drop anchor here. When leaving Auckland and heading south, the colour green and sheep dominate the gently curving landscape. Just over the hill, a small, timeless village by a lake appears. It's Hobbiton, one of the filming locations for Lord of the Rings, the well-known film directed by New Zealander Peter Jackson. Inspired by an English medieval village, the village of the Hobbits was created from scratch for production. It became a tourist attraction, and today you can visit a place that was popular with the Hobbits, the Green Dragon Inn. The earth houses have been adapted to the Hobbit's small stature. The indoor scenes were filmed in a studio. Henry Horn is well acquainted with Hobbiton.
So, all the interior film work, which was all done in the studios in Wellington, and the only house you ever see inside of throughout the trilogy is Bag End, which is the home of Frodo and Bilbo. So this village has been created for the exterior illusion for the filming process.
Further down south in Rotorua, fumaroles escape from the ground. The water vapour passes through the cracks in the rock. It indicates the presence of hot springs. When the steam is subjected to high pressure, it's ejected in the form of a geyser. The pressure depends on the ground itself. When there's little pressure, the steam drains away without spattering. The vents can form into small craters.
Yeah, so in this region there are a lot of geysers because there's just heat coming from the Earth's core trying to get to the surface. Whether that takes the form of a mud pool or a geyser or a fumarole, a steam vent, everything is basically heat coming to the surface.
The North Island owes a lot to hot water springs. In fact, sometimes it's referred to as the Smoky Island. Maori people have been using hot springs to keep warm, wash, make remedies and cook their food for a long time. The braided baskets plunged into the boiling water allows for food to be cooked within minutes. It's a natural, healthy and very eco-friendly way of cooking. Maoris didn't have to cut down trees to cook or keep warm. Consequently, the hot water springs also contributed to protecting the environment. The Rotorua Museum is dedicated to Maori culture. For centuries, getting tattoos has been a Maori custom. Their tattoos have been copied around the world. Tattoos here aren't a fashion statement. It's a process which hails back to ancient practices. Jason Phillips is a tattoo artist.
It's a tradition in our culture because in the old days, people of high rank, if you were a chief, if you were a princess, if you were a high-ranked woman or man, you may have been a super-duper warrior, you may have been the shaman, you may have been a master at some sort of art. You had to be someone special to earn a Māori tattoo, okay?
The Maori culture is full of symbols.
Our instruments are on that sacred level again. They all have a meaning, they all have a purpose. This one relates to It's a war. It's a war trumpet. It's very loud. I don't know if it's good for your speakers or not.
The South Island has a more regular geometric shape than its neighbour. It stretches over 1,000 kilometres. Running along the length of it are the Southern Alps. This mountain range is the real backbone of the island. Because of its mountainous area, the South Island is far less populated than the North Island. The land around it can be arid at times, which means there are few populated areas. In the lower half of the island, more inland, the city opens onto the edge of Lake Wakatipu. It stretches over 80 kilometres and is the longest lake in the country. The life of this quiet town was turned upside down after it was established in the mid-19th century. Gold was discovered in the region and led to a mining rush, but it ran out and Queenstown went back to being a quiet town. Today, it's still a peaceful place, completely surrounded by nature. Paragliding is one of the most exhilarating sports at the resort, but also one of the most long-standing. In Queenstown, interaction with nature is often spectacular. On the water, underwater, above water, modern techniques even allow for the laws of gravity to be defied. Thrust by a jet of water, the flyboard could almost be mistaken for a dolphin. The speedboats really show off their moves. Not to mention the upward parachute and the stunning view you get over the lake. Lake Wakatipu stretches out over a deep glacial valley. In places, it reaches a depth of almost 400 metres. Every 25 minutes, the water level goes up and down by 10 centimetres. This phenomenon is due to the particular shape of the lake. The Maori thought that this regular movement was caused by a monster breathing at the bottom of the water. At the foot of Mount Nicholas, the banks of Lake Wakatipu become wider, opening up all the space needed for rural activities. These banks have provided a good breeding ground, particularly for merino sheep. If the flock of sheep stay perfectly grouped together, it's because merino sheep are kept in line and monitored by vigilant sheepdogs. Merino sheep are among the best producers of wool. In tight formation, they're led to the barn to be sheared. The sheep are quite used to it and don't shy away from the shears.
She'll say hi, she doesn't mind, she likes being on camera, don't you?
There's a lot of different breeds in New Zealand. There's about 30 million sheep and only about 4 million of those are merinos. Most other breeds in New Zealand are for meat production, whereas merinos are quite unique in that we farm them for wool production.
The sheep easily adapt to different environments.
Sheep are a very important part of the New Zealand economy. They basically were the backbone of farming in New Zealand for some years. They've now been outgrown by the dairy industry, but in areas of New Zealand like this that are have more challenging terrain and mountains where you can't run dairy cattle, sheep is still a very, very important part of farming in New Zealand.
The Southern Alps are a major obstacle as they're tricky to climb. In fact, around 15 summits are over 3,000 metres high. And the upward trend still continues because mountains are getting 1 centimetre higher every year. That said, erosion flattens the summits and hollows out very deep valleys, such as the one in the Shotover River. This river is an ideal place for those who are good at jet boating. The jet boat's speed is impressive. And yet, the propulsion system is completely eco-friendly. Kevin Malloy.
The jet boat. It's a New Zealand invention. Works by sucking the water up and pushing it out the back at about 400 litres a second. So we're driven by a big jet of water.
In the 19th century, gold was found in the river. Hence the remains of the fixtures that were used by the gold panners. Some discoveries appeared to be a miracle.
That dredge not so much, but yes, on the river where we are now, 2 shepherds in 1862. They found 12.5 kilos one afternoon with a pan and a knife.
A miraculous catch which fishermen can't help but dream of.
So rainbow trout, native to New Zealand.
A suspension bridge spans across the gorge of the Karawau River. In the past, gold diggers would make use of it. Standing 43 metres high, the bridge was the birthplace of bungee jumping. Cameron Frere is one of the current organisers.
I don't know if it's New Zealand sport, but it's definitely a hobby that everyone's associated with New Zealand and AJ Hackett, just because we were one of the first people to do it commercially, and people find it the home of bungee. So most people, when they want to do their first bungee, they want to come to the original site, which is the Karawau Bungee Bridge. 2, 1.
So what are your impressions?
It was really good, really enjoyed it. A little bit of a moment before I fell when I was thinking, is this a great idea? But once I was going, really good.
The length of the bungee is measured out so that jumpers can skim just over the water. The first bungee jumps were done in New Zealand in the 1980s. At first, bungee jumpers were attached by a simple vine. Today, safety measures and technology have developed. The bungee is adjusted according to the jumper's weight, which is written on their hand to avoid any confusion. The landing recovery method is very simple.
Once in a lifetime!
Enthusiasm for bungee jumping isn't dying down. The recipe for success? Strict adherence to safety. The Southern Alps stop the very humid ocean currents coming in from the west. As a result, precipitation on the mountains is a lot heavier on the western slopes. When they arrived, the first Maori people noticed a long white cloud in the distance. It served as a landmark. They called their new land Aotearoa, the country of the long white cloud. The erosion of glaciers is spectacular. When a glacier retreats and the sea fills the valley, it creates a ford, like Doubtful Sound in the southwestern part of the island. The name comes from the fact that the first explorers doubted that the fjord was navigable. But since then, sailors have become well acquainted with it. Dave Allen.
Oh, fjord's it's a Scandinavian name, and it's typically created by glacial carving. So in Fjordland, they tell us over the last 2 million years, we've had 20 ice ages, one every 10,000 years or so.
Hundreds of waterfalls flow into the fjord with fresh water. But the fresh water stays on the surface. It doesn't mix with the salt water. These two different layers of water block out the sunlight. The fjord's water is therefore darker. The steep banks are completely covered by dense vegetation. So much so that the trees are also enveloped by other plants. Thanks to boats, we can access a world which would be completely inaccessible via dry land. 40 kilometers later, Doubtful Sound comes out onto the Tasman Sea. On the wave-beaten rocks, seals take a nap. When on ground, seals always lie down as they are unable to stay upright. In the valley of the Karawau River, gold diggers have left numerous traces of their trails. Today, the precious metal rush is nothing more than a distant memory. Sometimes there may be some unexpected remains. From a boomtown such as Cromwell, the Southern Alps undergo severe erosion. They are young mountains with steep slopes. The rocks at the summit are naturally carried down towards the valley, and with the frequent earthquakes, they come down even quicker. The rocks are weathered by exposure to the sun, wind, and also freezing processes. Heavy precipitation fuels the numerous watercourses. Taken away by the current, the rock is torn off the mountain and reduced to a powder. It whitens the water all the way to the ocean. A lake sometimes forms at the foot of a glacier. The Tasman Glacier is the largest in the country. It ends up in a lake of milky water. Enormous blocks of ice detach from the glacier and float around before melting. There are over 3,000 glaciers in New Zealand, but their surface continues to fade away. The high mountainous landscapes are constantly evolving. The erosion and movement of the Earth's crust keeps changing the layout of places. In fact, the island's highest point, Mount Cook, has varied by 40 or so meters since it was first measured. Matthew Wayne Hollands knows this region well.
The Mount Cook up there, that's our country's largest mountain, so it's 3,724 metres above sea level. Our biggest peak, it has a 1-mile summit ridgeline. It was first climbed on Christmas Day in 1894, As you saw, it was quite steep, a very challenging mountain for all the mountaineers that attempt to climb that mountain.
The snow, tightly compacted by its own weight, turns into ice. It flows into the glaciers, which move over considerable distances. The largest glaciers in New Zealand are almost 30 kilometres long. Some go down to an altitude of only 300 metres. The ocean is only 10 or so kilometres away. On the road leading down from Mount Cook, Lake Pukaki is a stunning sight, vibrant with colour. The water in this glacial lake contains rock flour, a very fine powder. The particles absorb all the colours of the light apart from blue and green, which it reflects and is what we can see. Fish really appreciate the lake's waters. In the fish pens, salmon need cold, clean and well-oxygenated water. In the Banks Peninsula, the water from the Pacific bathes the village of Akaroa. Boats make use of this centuries-old popular anchorage site. In the 19th century, the English dominated the North Island and the South Island remained free. The Europeans bought the Banks Peninsula from the Maoris. They established a colony which was unable to resist the British for long, apart from 2 villages where colonists wormed their way in. Akaroa is one of those 2 villages. The traces left by the colonists are still visible. They were French. Today, some of the inhabitants are direct descendants of the French colonists. In fact, you can spot them at first glance. At the Giant's House, artistic creation takes over every nook and cranny. All materials are gathered together for inspiration. Wood, metal, glass, ceramics, terracotta. Well beyond the borders of her garden, which could be an art gallery, the artist Josie Martin finds inspiration by the bucket load.
Here at the Giant's House, we have people from all around the world visit every day, and that is also inspiration.
But where do all these imaginary creatures come from?
But because I've travelled a lot, it is a bit like a diary for me, my life and travels, and the things I love. It's my passion.
The remains of New Zealand's volcanoes are not always visible. This is the case for Akaroa Harbour, which is situated in the crater of a very old volcano. The volcanic cone was 1,500 metres high and rose right in the middle of the sea. Nowadays, some of the volcano's hills are almost completely worn down, as erosion unrelentingly continues its undermining process. It has created some enormous excavations in the rock. The grotto called Cathedral Cave could house a cathedral. It serves as a very useful shelter for this seal colony. New Zealand's coastline has other surprises, providing that you don't stray too far out. Less than a kilometre away from the coastline, you can catch a glimpse of an endangered marine species, Hector's dolphin. This mammal only lives in New Zealand. It's the rarest and smallest of all the dolphins in the world. On the other end of the planet, New Zealand has made the most of its isolated state. Its unchanging traditions and unspoilt landscapes shows the country in its true light. External influences have been integrated, but its strong character has remained. Today, New Zealand has grown into a real, eco-friendly culture.